So I'm playing this animation for you that I saw on X, and I bookmarked it to make a video on it later. And I'm going through my bookmarks here, so now's the time. I love animations like this, and I'm going to make an attempt to explain to you why, and we're going to hit a whole bunch of themes that have massive application to your life and could empower you to do things, to see things that you would not otherwise see, and to do things that you could not otherwise do. So those are some high claims. Let's see if we can make good on them. So at some point during my professional trajectory of getting a computer science degree, working as a developer, going back to school to get graduate degrees, becoming a professor, creating a tech startup, etc., I came across this idea that, well, I didn't come across it. I developed this idea that a problem's difficulty is not an intrinsic property, that the difficulty of something is dependent on its representation. Now, what do I mean by representation? Well, in the programming world, if you're even a little familiar with it, this is going to generate a whole lot of it's going to tie to a lot of things that you're familiar with. You know, how do you store data on a disk? How do you represent information in code? But what if you're not a programmer? What does representation mean? Well, look at this Rubik's Cube. Now, it's a toy, but it's actually a representation of information. The colors on the squares and the arrangement of the squares, that's information. So where these things are in relationship to each other, now you start to bridge into how that is represented. So this cube, you can spin it in certain ways. That's how you manipulate it. It's how you move around the colors. But every piece of how you envision and interact with this thing, that's part of the representation. So like each one of these cubes, it has the colors on the sides. And that's not something that you can change. The sticker, well, unless you pull the stickers off, which is an old trick for kids to use to cheat. But that's already there. The information is there. But you can represent that information in terms of these blocks that you can move around. But you have to move them around according to certain rules. All right? And the representation is highly coupled to the rules. They're interconnected. And so if the problem is, how do you get all the colors on each side to match each other? The solution, when you're talking about the cube itself, might be really, really, really hard for someone to figure out. Maybe your strategy at this is just to turn it randomly and hope that one day all the colors match up. Now, if you do that, it's going to take a very, very, very long time to get the thing solved. Okay? You might not even be able to guarantee that you'll finish it in your lifetime. Does that make it impossible? Some would say that it does. Now, as we're talking through this, I want you to imagine any problem in your life. Are there problems that people think are impossible? There are, tons and tons. But are they impossible? And how could you really tell? What's the difference between an impossible problem and a very difficult one? What's the difference between a very, very difficult problem and a slightly less difficult problem? What makes a problem easy? What makes a problem hard? Well, a huge chunk of the answer to these questions is the representation of the information. So now we look at this awesome animated graph over here. And of course, these are tied to each other so that the representation of the one is in time is the same as the other, and that's why they're moving at the same time. Making things like this from things like that is basically how I've spent the last 20 years of my life. And it's been an absolutely amazing adventure. Because what I have found is that an awful lot of problems that people think are impossible are actually just really hard. And the only reason they're really hard is that going from this to this, drawing the picture, right? And being able to do these animations in your head, doing that is way, way harder than coming up with a solution once you have this. The number of people that can do that, it's way less than an order of magnitude less than the number of people who can solve it once they have this. Now let me just, if you do me the favor, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the programming world. If I showed this animation to any run-of-the-mill programmer, odds are that 80% of them could write code to do, for the computer to do what is happening in this animation. I'm trying to keep that high level, right? This is called a clustering problem. And it's got constraints, which are that the dots move around the wheels. And so you could write code that would shuffle around these dots in a way that would guarantee a solution. And you could have different approaches to this that might do it faster or slower, right? Any programmer worth their salt could do that. But how many programmers could look at this Rubik's Cube and just sit there and think for a really long time and then come up with this representation? Very, very few. And actually, this is an easier kind of mapping. These tasks get way more difficult, way more difficult. And so, for example, in my startup, again, just keeping this high level, so don't get bogged down in details that are hard to explain anyway, we had a whole stack of these kinds of problems that were necessary to solve the main problem. And we crushed them. And what would happen is, I'd have maybe up to 24 employees, and they really weren't able to do this jump. And so I had to do the jumps. And then I'd hand it off to them. And for the most part, they'd be able to finish the task. So one of the hardest things about making this leap is courage or faith, however you want to define or whatever aspect of that you want to highlight. It's really, really, really difficult to stare into an abyss and think that if you do it for long enough, you're going to see light. Now, I'll leave it to you to make the gospel connections there. But you might want to read the story of the creation or the first chapter of John or many other places in the scriptures. But those are two good places to start. This level of creativity is extraordinarily difficult and immensely valuable. And so sometimes what I did this with one student in particular. I had a problem that I absolutely wanted to solve and was going to have an enormous impact in the field. And I just couldn't set aside the time to tackle it. And he needed a problem for his master's thesis. And I said, okay, here's your problem. And roughly speaking, here is how you're going to find the solution to this. I said, I can't prove to you that the solution exists, but I have a very strong hunch that it does. And here's your rough parameters for how you're going to do this. And he sat at a whiteboard for weeks. And I kept coming back to him and I said, you've verged off the tracks. Why are you reverting to how everyone else tries to solve this problem? They haven't solved it and they say it's impossible. If you do anything like what they're doing, you will also fail. And essentially, not in so many words, he kept saying that he was scared. He was scared that if he did it my way, he wasn't going to find the solution. And I said, you're just wasting time. You have to stare into the abyss. It's the only way to solve these kinds of problems. Now, I've done the hardest part for you. I've told you where to look. I've told you where the solution is going to be. And he just fought that for weeks. And finally, he stared into the abyss, and in very short order, in far less time than he had wasted trying to solve the problem in the same ways as everyone who had failed, he found the solution. And again, I'm sparing you all the details, but we were able to do what everyone else thought was impossible. And actually, once it was done, it was really easy to see it. And it's just seemed like it was a mystery why no one had figured it out before. And that's a hallmark of these kinds of problems, right? So, what application does this have to anything in your life? Well, it has a bunch. First off, a lot of the things that you think are basic and simple aren't. They're actually really complicated. And it's a good thing that you don't see the complexity that's swarming around you because it would overwhelm you. But as you turn your life to God, He's going to increase your awareness. And you're going to get a much more accurate sense of the amount of complexity in and around you all the time. And so you need tools to better deal with this so you don't get overwhelmed and so you can continue to function. Now, stating it that way, you might say, well, why bother? Why would anyone want to see the complexity? Well, because you can't solve these problems without it. That's why. And you might say, well, this seems like it's literally a toy, but this seems like something meaningless. It might be some nerdy puzzle or some intellectual puzzle. But surely real problems aren't like this. Oh, yes, they are. Oh, yes, they are. Like I said, the more your awareness increases, the more you're going to see that you're surrounded by complexity. And the things that you thought were simple, either someone else did this to work out the solution, and what you're doing is you're seeing that the solution is simple. But that doesn't mean that the problem is simple. It just means someone did the work for you. Or what you think is a solution is not a solution. It's just a temporary thing that suspends the problem for now. You're kicking a can down the road. But someone at some point is going to have to contend with that can. Now, how does this work for that's sort of a temporal approach? How does this work for spiritual things? Well, a giant piece of the puzzle, as far as the kingdom of God goes, is the structure of that kingdom. Now, this is kind of a meta approach to this. On the one hand, you have to understand that structure in times to come, or else you will be overcome by problems that you otherwise would be able to overcome. But also, in a very real sense, and this is tied to your ability to see and make use of that structure, it becomes increasingly important to understand that the world is far more complicated than you see, and that we do not make equal contributions to the solutions of its problems. And so maybe that seems like it's a little cryptic, but I don't think it's worth an attempt to try to explain it further right now under this context. So hopefully something here stirred up some thoughts in you and led to something that's actionable in your life.